the 2-minute drill. All right, time to talk some Hard Knocks offseason of the New York Giants. The latest brand extension for Hard Knocks. We had the OG model coming in a couple weeks to Chicago Bears. We have the in-season version, which this year is going to be the entire AFC North. Now we have offseason covering the New York Football Giants. So join me today to break down the premiere episode of Hard Knocks offseason is the great Alan Austin. Alan, how are you?
Mike, thanks for having me. Not quite at the football season yet, but Hard Knocks is ready to bring us some content.
Yeah, they absolutely are. And I love the fact that we're getting, this off-season version here, which, the fact it was the Giants basically said, okay, I'm going to be checking it out anyway. But, I thought what we got was pretty cool.
Interesting. I had some problems with it, and I'll get into it once we start up here. But I wouldn't say I was a huge fan of what we saw last night, but the peek behind the curtain is always welcome.
Yeah, I felt like there were bits that were clearly just set up for the cameras. But I think there was also stuff I thought was, natural. It looked pretty cool.
Yeah, okay, so we'll just jump right in for my general thoughts here. When I'm watching a show like this, I'm keeping in mind that a casual football fan or non-football fan is not watching this program.
Correct.
So you've already got to go in with the mindset that this is for the hardcore fans, this is for football nerds, this is for people who are really in the weeds. So with that in mind, I wanted to learn something about the process, about how they look at things, and I did not learn a thing last night. There was so much time spent on stuff that we already know the answers to. So again, you've got the hardcore fans watching. We already know they don't have Saquon. We already know they have Burns. We already know they didn't sign Chris Jones. And while we want to see how that process is made, this whole first episode was setting things up that we already know. And we as the hardcore fans would rather have the first episode be the entire Brian Burns transaction. Let's get to how the sausage is made in the factory. Again, these are hardcore fans watching. We don't need to set up as many storylines as a traditional Hard Knocks. I get that it's an editorial structure. I get that. But again, this is more information. This is not a narrative show we really need to get storylines going on. I was looking to see how the trade for Brian Burns came down. I was looking to see how the Saquon conversation. I don't need a room full of scouts telling me that Chris Jones is a good player when we, A, don't ever think the Giants are going to sign him, and B, already know that they didn't. So what I was really looking for was something new, something to learn. What is a thought process that general managers in the NFL have that we are not seeing as an audience that will further enlighten us as we look at future off seasons? I didn't get any of that. Honestly, as a Giant fan, I came out liking Joe Schoen less. He was the big catalyst for not signing Saquon. I wanted Saquon. He also did the whole, I'm just an ordinary guy storyline. I have my PB&J, yada, yada, yada. Look, that's your choice. We get it. You make a ton of money. You're still a real guy, a real down home guy. Got it. Awesome. Show us how you're making moves and what the thought process is. Don't just give us a litany of players and list their resumes and what you think they're going to cost and call that an episode. And I think that's a little bit of what we got for the most part. I also didn't love the bit where he's with the other GMs. He just felt like the guy cracking jokes and the other guys were like, all right, here comes Joe making his comments. And when you're told, how about giving us 2 firsts for Burns? What's the catch? Why are you willing to trade Burns? I know deep down you're not going to want to re-sign him. You're not going to want to pay him. Get into that a little bit more. Don't just make it seem like eventually a Brian Burns trade is coming because one guy commented to Joe Schoen one day. I wanted to see more nuts and bolts and less generalizations. Sorry, went on a rant, but those are my general thoughts.
Yeah, I could definitely see your argument there. I feel like they sort of went into this sort of okay, we're going to go chronologically through the offseason. It's okay, this is what happened in January. We're going to get to free agency and the combine, the draft, going in order. You wanted more okay, this is the exciting thing that happened. Let's do a whole episode on the Brian Burns process, or let's do an episode on Saquon, as opposed to we're gonna go through by the calendar basically and end on minicamp.
Right, and I get that that's one structure they wanted to use. It just doesn't interest me as much as someone who A, is a fan who's hardcore enough to watch this program, and B, knows all the moves they've made to this point. So we're not setting up these shocking reveals that they were able to pull off a Brian Burns trade. We already know that happened. So I'd rather see the behind the scenes of how a deal like that comes together. That's what I was looking for through a program like this. And now I know going forward, they're setting it up in the calendar structure, chronological order on a bunch of stuff we already know the end result to. And based on that first episode, it doesn't look like we'll get a ton of the nuts and bolts and what really goes into it. We'll just get generalizations. And I know the Giants have heavy editorial control over what's presented. So I was underwhelmed.
Yeah, for sure. Let's get to like some of the stuff we got in this episode. Obviously, we basically learned very quickly, like, this is going to be Joe Schoen's the main character of Hard Knocks offseason. We got his whole backstory. He was the common thread, which makes sense. This is the front office show. He's the GM. So, like, we got a lot of, like, here's Joe Schoen's backstory. He was a scout at one point. He's his PB&J. Like, they did a lot of work to set up Joe Schoen as our main character of Hard Knocks offseason.
Yep, and I'm sure we'll get the Dayball character breakdown at another episode. Shane was the guy, because if they want to look at it from the offseason, from the front office, he's the figurehead, so that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, like anything like catch your fancy on Joe Schoen, or just like stuff he's like not really interested in?
Like I said, he seemed like the guy who cracked jokes with his old friends and like bit on bait, and you know, I know they did a lot of stuff for the camera, like those scout meetings. Joe Schoen saying things like, Josh Jacobs won a rushing title, right? And it's like, I get it. You're phrasing it that way for the camera, but I sure hope he knows who wins the rushing title every season. You know what I mean? So it just felt staged so much that I really don't think I got a real sense on how Joe Schoen's football mind works.
Yeah, sure. Let's get to those meetings. Like one of the running backs, one of the defensive like players here, like, basically, it's like Joe Schoen in a room with all their pro scouts and like coaches, and like sort of going, oh, here's a look at like what our options are at running back. Like we talk about Tony Pollard. Here's what he made. They've got the graphs on the screen. Here's what he made. Here's like what he did last year. Here's Josh Jacobs. Here's like Devin Singletary, who we know they're going to end up signing. Like a bunch of names here. Like you felt like this did not work for you the way they set that. You felt like this was staged.
It was definitely, well, here's the problem. That's stuff that we all as football fans assume happens on, like, you know, football scouting 101. Like, we all assume that is what happens. I wanted to see a layer deeper. And we got the very base layer as if someone who barely watches football was going to watch and say, oh, what's this about? The people watching this figure that happens already. Again, not learning anything new. I don't need you to sit there months after, when we already know what transpired, and talk about how Josh Jacobs is a good player. Yeah, we know. The hardcore fans watching this show know. And we know he didn't get signed. Now, if you're going to, they barely touched on the thought process of, and this was just in a conversation with Mr. Mara, oh, Joe Mixon may get cut and we could sign him later. Those are a little bit more detailed, but they only scratch the surface. We got a lot of generalizations in both the running back and the defensive line meeting. I was a little bit like underwhelmed by that, and it just felt very base level and staged, like you said, for people who aren't watching the show, which we don't need.
Yeah, it does feel a little bit like. Did you watch the very first episode of Hard Knocks in season with the Colts?
No, I didn't watch that this season.
No, it was the very first Hard Knocks in season a couple of years ago, like where they basically did a whole montage, basically catch up what the Colts had done to that point in the season. I feel like this sort of same thing. Oh, like, here's what you need to know about the running backs that are on the market. So on, like, stuff like we as football fans knew that, right? They don't think they needed to illustrate that level of detail to us.
I agree. What they should have done is, if they're going to do that, make it about Singletary, show us how that transaction went down, show us why real quick we didn't get Josh Jacobs in a passing comment. We don't need a full graphic and breakdown. And just show us how the Devin Singletary transaction came and how it correlates with Saquon. You could do a whole episode about the running back situation. But because of the structure they're using, we're not going to get it in that fashion.
Yeah, we're going to get it in probably like a few weeks, not today.
And again, we already know what happened.
Yep. Go to the Daniel Jones stuff, too. Get a little bit of his rehab process. This is, I felt, was the most staged part of the episode. We have these conversations with, like, Shane, the assistant GM, talk about, oh, like, we're committed to Jones for a few years. Like, we have to build a line in front of him. We need resources. Like, we believe in him. He's our guy. Like, this to me felt like the most, like, the Giants went in and did the edit for this episode and said, hey, like, we want to hype up Daniel Jones. So let's just talk about how great he is in this episode.
100%. It was conversations that were HBO coming in saying, just take us through one of your meetings. And then them saying, let's talk about this. Exactly what you're saying. It's very narrative based, and it's frustrating. Like, this isn't your traditional Hard Knocks where we have the storylines we like to follow. You know, the difference between this Hard Knocks and that is the team-based Hard Knocks about training camp. We're getting to know players that we can follow, that we can fall in love with, that we can, you know, that we can say, oh, that guy got cut. Well, I'm going to follow his career and see where he catches on. They don't need that here. This is all front office guys. So it's just I would have went about this show a completely different way than the traditional Hard Knock narratives. And that's kind of what they're doing with Jones here, what you're talking about.
Yeah, I just felt like this is very much like a puff piece for Daniel Jones. Like, oh, like, he's such a great quarterback. He had no help last year. We're going to fix him. And so it's like, a lot of Giant fans don't feel that way.
No, I'm one of them. I'm not a believer in Daniel Jones. And to just sit there and say, you know, okay, he's coming back from this knee injury. Well, the offensive line moves other than Andrew Thomas have not really worked. So, you know, I'm at a loss of words when it comes to Jones, and that's showing right now on this podcast. But I didn't really care about that Jones segment. Like you said, it felt like puff. It's like, okay, we're watching him get his knee massage. Again, another thing we already think is happening. A more interesting route would have been, here's our star quarterback. How does he feel about making this much money and the pressure of recovering from injury? Not the fact that he needs to.
I was talking about that. I was talking more about, like, the meeting that, like, Shane had with assistant GM.
Oh, yes. That meeting was completely set up by production to preface the segment that followed.
Yeah. Yeah, that's for sure here. I think the segment that worked the most for me was, like, when they brought in the new defensive coordinator, Shane Bowen, who is not a guy I'm sure many Giant fans are familiar with. Like, his entry meeting, talking about, oh, this is the kind of guys I need for my defense. Like, here's some options here. I thought that worked the best of, like, the big meetings they gave us.
I will concur that was my favorite segment of the episode. They preface why, you know, I thought the quick little Dayball Schoen thrown together. Oh, this guy's good. Look at some of these top 10 stats. I thought that was a little staged as well, just to get like some exposition on the guy. But like you said, the meeting where he's got the whole room, you know, and he's saying, I'm building my defense. Here's the guys we have now. Could they fit the roles I'm looking to fill, or do we need to go elsewhere? I enjoyed that segment as well.
Is that something we don't really get in terms of, like, we always hear, like, oh, like, you know, like, new coach that comes in, they're going to fit the talent in the room to their scheme, they're going to adapt. Like, this is a good example of something we don't see all the time.
No, I wish we got a little bit more of it, and I hope we do going forward, especially when they acquire Burns.
Yeah, for sure. We also get some of the scouting stuff. We see Joe Schoen on the road at the East-West game and the Senior Bowl, and, like, we get his little banter with Dan Morgan, who's now the Panther GM, like, talking about, and he casually throws out would you be interested in moving Brian Burns? We get the Shane cracking a joke about well, maybe a little too high for our blood. We can talk about this, but, like, I guess we kind of knew, like, these kind of conversations happen, these back channels at places where all they gather, like the Senior Bowl and Combine. We'll probably see more of this, but, like, I think it was like this was just a setup for, like, what's going to happen in a few episodes from now.
Yeah, I'm interested to know if that was authentic. You know, if that's when and where it transpired, or if Shane said, hey, can you say it on camera? Like, I'm interested to see what the framework of a deal was prior or after and how much that moment really did. But for the sake of the show, yes, you got to think that these are the kind of things we want to see. These general managers having these handshake deals, having these discussions off the side. You know, that stuff is more of what I want to see. So I did enjoy it for that aspect.
Yeah, I do feel like this episode did felt like a pilot episode where it's like, oh, here are our storylines we're going to follow during the season. We're going to see a couple of things here, like in terms of the chronology. Like, you keep an eye on these things for casual football fans. You know, we're going to get to them eventually.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the last one, I think the other thing that really, I think, was interesting to me was, like, the conversation between John Mara and Joe Schoen about Saquon, which I think was interesting, where you can really see that Shane's started digging his heels and, like, we shouldn't pay Saquon. We have too many other needs. And John Mara is like, yeah, but, like, he's our offense. What are we going to do if he leaves? I think that was sort of something that, like, I feel like Giant fans get frustrated by knowing, like, Mara sort of has this perception of, like, I sort of this old school perception, like, Shane's trying to do it a different way.
It was definitely interesting, and it showed me a couple things. One, that Shane has power. He has power within the organization. It's not one of those other franchises where the owner calls every final shot. It really felt like Mara's going to discuss, he's going to give his point of view, but he's going to defer to the man he hired for this job. And isn't that what we as football fans often, cry out for?
Yes.
So in that sense, it's interesting to see. You really learned from this episode. The other thing was that Shane was the guy not signing Saquon.
Yeah.
It was very clear that he doesn't value a running back at that price point, and he thinks you can replace that production, and he's afraid of the injury history. Now, those are all valid concerns and points to make. I'm just, as a Giant fan, Saquon is our most valuable player. He's our most popular player, and it sucked losing him. So it was a little bittersweet to hear. And, bittersweet in that it's nice to see a general manager having real power and the owner listening, but also seeing that's the reason my favorite player is not on our team anymore sucks.
Yeah, I also think they had a good point sort of previewing the situation with the assistant GM. I think it was, I forget the guy's name, but he's talking about when you work at the restaurant here, you don't want to pay filet mignon prices for sirloin. So it's sort of implying the whole mindset they have, Saquon's worth this. We're not going to pay top dollar for him when we have other issues we have to allocate better resources to.
Yeah, and let's remember that they come with that Buffalo mindset when it comes to running backs, but they had Josh Allen.
Yeah.
We don't have Josh Allen on the Giants. We need people who can compensate elsewhere, and Saquon was doing that for years, and now we don't have that anymore. And there's no one in the world who could tell me that Devin Singletary and others can equal Saquon. Just on pure talent, it ain't happening.
Yeah, I think that's about it for the episode. It was very short. It was only 40 minutes. Were you surprised it was that short?
I was. It was so short that I didn't even check how much time was left. It just kind of rolled.
Yeah.
So, it was really short. I was semi-shocked, but it might be the shortest episode of the season, or it might be on par with the rest. We'll soon find out.
Yeah, so give me a grade. What do you think about this episode on a scale of 1 to 10?
I'll give it a 6 with the hope that it gets less pilot feeling as it goes and gets more in the weeds and the real nuts and bolts of what these things are, how these transactions come to fruition, and not just generalization for narrative purposes.
I'm there with you on the 6. They set a lot of stuff up here. Obviously, we know what's going to happen with some of these things. Some of the stuff we saw in the trailer, I think I'm intrigued to get, especially that if we're going to get that conversation with Saquon, are you going to call us back with the offer or not? That's something I'm looking forward to seeing how that plays out. That's
a money moment that I also can't wait to see.
Yeah, they hyped it a lot in the trailer. I'm sure we'll get that. And we're looking forward to seeing their process of narrowing in on Malik Neighbors at the combine, stuff like that we're interested in.
Yep, same here.
All right, Alan, thanks all the time. Really appreciate it. People want to follow you on social media. How can they do that?
Thanks, Mike. Of course, always a pleasure. And I wish I had more positive things to say. I am a hardcore Giants fan, so I'm giving my honest feedback. My X/Twitter handle, I'm still not used to calling it X. I don't like calling it X. Allen _Austin_, ALLEN. So Allen _Austin_. And Mike, thanks for having me. I look forward to a better season from this point on of Hard Knocks. And I know you disagree, but let's go Giants.
Yeah, we'll see what happens there, Alan. Thanks all the time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike.